I hope you don't mind that I thought it would be more relaxed if I sit, but is that okay for everyone? Because it's really, really hot in here. So also thank you for bearing with me with the heat. I thought I would begin, before I go into my little talk, since there's so many women in the audience, I was talking to my colleague Catherine Porter in the Toronto bureau of the New York Times, and she was saying, if you're going to give a talk, I really suggest that you do the Wonder Woman pose in the bathroom before you show up for the talk, when you're supposed to stand like Wonder Woman, and it's supposed to decrease stress and release cortisol and make you give a good talk. So I can confirm I was just in the bathroom doing the Wonder Woman pose, and so I'm hoping it goes well, and that I will be slightly less perplexed looking than I look on the BBC in back of me. Anyway, it's really a pleasure to be here. When the international editor of the New York Times approached me this summer and asked if I would be willing to come back to Montreal after 28 years of being away, I must admit that I was at a loss for words, which is not something I usually suffer from. I was living in London at the time, having had a very crazy, frenetic news year after Brexit. There had been about 11 terrorist attacks, which Taylor mentioned. I'd shadowed President Obama and Pope Benedict in Eastern Europe, and among other assignments, I'd written about high technology brothels in Antwerp. So while I was very excited about rediscovering Canada and Montreal, some of my dearest friends warned me to consider whether about writing about Canada, this prosperous slice of Scandinavia on top of the United States, that I might find it a bit bland. Was I being plucked from London and sent to a giant country where nothing ever happens? I asked myself, where the big news of the week is whether our perfectly coiffed Prime Minister is doing the Bhangra in Bombay, or whether you say baby boom or bebe boom, or bonjour hi or bonjour, which was actually the first story I wrote about, much to many people's delight after I arrived in Montreal. Leonard Cohen, who grew up in Westmount, farther up the mountain than I did, used to say that he would return to Montreal to commune with his neurotic affiliations. And I really kind of knew what he meant. The person who seemed most happy about me coming home after so many years was my mom, who had still not recovered from the fact that I had skipped town when I was 18. And she would try constantly to entice me home with Montreal bagels. And like all mothers, she had this incredible ability to kind of track me down at the worst possible times during my career. So I would be interviewing a jihadist who I'd spend 6 months trying to get access to, and my phone would ring and I'd see, mom on the iPhone. Or, I'd be in a war zone in Central Asia, there would be bombs falling in the background, mom was calling again. And then when I did not pick up the iPhone, as we don't do, because we're away at university and we're very busy, I would get an email with the subject line, your parents, remember us, ? So also happy about my return was my 81-year-old father, who went to McGill from the age of 16 until the age of 32. Including undergraduate and medical school, internship, residency, and he'd reacted with absolute horror when I decided I was desperate to go away to university in the US and not go to McGill. So he's very excited that I'm here today and I finally set foot in this building. He said to me, why do you need to go abroad for an overpriced artsy-fartsy degree when there's so many good universities in Montreal, like McGill? Only years later, when he would see my stories in the New York Times while on vacation in Miami, did he recover. In any case, my initial reservations about coming home quickly disappeared once I realized that Montreal and Canada were actually a cosmic opportunity for a journalist. And getting to cover your own country with foreign eyes after so many years of being away is really an amazing virtue as a journalist. In fact, it's really kind of Canada's moment, both institutionally at the New York Times, but also geopolitically in the world. The reason is that, you may not realize this, Canada is actually the biggest, most important market for the New York Times outside the United States. The paper's been covering Canada since 1851, its first year of operation as a newspaper, and the nation's birth in 1867 was actually on the front page of the New York Times. Now, even more surprising, I learned this recently, half the newsprint of the New York Times was produced in a small, unpronounceable North Ontario town called Kapuskasing. And in the 1920s, the New York Times invested about $500 million to build a railroad and to have access to about 1,000 tons of newsprint from these trees in this small Canadian town, which would end up in the clamorous docks of Times Square and end up in the New York Times building. which is a very kind of interesting fact. Since there's also so many women here, it's also worth noting that I have some very big shoes to fill. And one of the most important New York Times foreign correspondents was a woman. In fact, she was a pioneering foreign correspondent called Tanya Long, who ran the Ottawa bureau from 1952 until 1964 with her husband, Raymond Dannell. And she covered the Blitz in London during World War II from the third floor of the Savoy Hotel, which was being bombed. And she still managed to file her stories. She covered the rise and fall of Hitler, the liberation by the Allies, the liberation of Berlin, and she was the first female correspondent to do so. And she also covered the Nuremberg trials. Then after all that, she got sent to Canada. This is sounding eerily familiar to me, where one of her first stories with her husband was whether the Canadian Maple Leaf should have one red maple leaf or three. So I'm looking forward to what awaits me here. Her and her husband became such stalwarts of Canadian journalism that when they left, Lester B. Pearson, who was the prime minister at the time, actually gave them like a gala goodbye. So why is it such a great moment for the Times in Canada? So one reason is the so-called Trump effect. Since President Trump came into office and started ridiculing the failing New York Times, we've actually gone up to 2.5 million subscribers, and we thank Trump for that. Canadians, like the rest of the world, are trying to understand the surreal B-movie that's unspooling across the border in the United States. And so it's become a very important time to read American newspapers. At the same time, because of Trump, people are looking to Canada as a liberal counterpoint to the United States in a way that they seldom have before. So, Bernie Sanders traveled here recently, and if you look at everything from healthcare policy to immigration policy, suddenly Canada matters a great deal. And while Trudeau may be buffeted by scandal at home, and then we all look at his wife's floral sari and his Bangra moves and his kurtas that were on display during his trip last Friday, I was actually getting ready to open up a bottle of wine on last Friday, and my phone rang. Can you do a story about Trudeau's, costume changes during his trip to India and what it means geopolitically for the region? So I'm very thankful for Justin. But on a serious note, because of Trump's heralding America first, people are actually looking to Canada as the leader of the Western liberal order. Angela Merkel in Germany is slowly heading to the political wilderness. And other than Emmanuel Macron of France, who I had the pleasure of covering when I was the Paris correspondent, there really aren't that many leaders with the charisma of Trudeau. So that's also made the New York Times very interested in Canada. Every time I mention Justin, I put him in the headline, and the number of clicks goes up exponentially. Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit of my career trajectory and how a nerdy teenager from Montreal ended up at the New York Times. If there's such a thing as the Canadian dream, I guess you could say in some ways I embody it. My great-grandfather on my father's side was a fruit peddler who peddled fruit in Old Montreal. Didn't speak any English. He spoke Yiddish. He came from a shtetl in Eastern Europe. And within a few years, he brought over his entire family. My great-grandfather on my other side was a presser in the Plateau, where I now live, and has become horribly gentrified, and I think you would be shocked to see my rent today. My grandparents met when they were 10 years old in elementary school. They were sitting on opposite ends of a classroom. My grandfather fancied my grandmother and threw a piece of chalk at her and had to stay after the class and write on the blackboard, "I will not throw chalk at the girl's side." My grandfather was about 5'2" and ginger-haired. My grandmother was a very beautiful woman who fancied herself a sort of Victorian queen. And she said no for like 2 years. And my grandfather was so tenacious, he eventually broke her down and she agreed to marry him. And I think some of my tenacity as a journalist probably and possibly comes from my grandfather. And then my father was a doctor who spent his entire life at McGill, I mentioned, and then I ended up at the New York Times. When I was a teenager, I was desperate to leave Montreal and see the world. And after I went to Herzliya High School, I begged my father to send me to University of the United States. And I told you his reaction already. I was so unbearable at my lobbying every day at the dinner table that when I was at Marianopolis suffering through organic chemistry, he eventually relented and let me go to University of Pennsylvania. And the last nail in the coffin of my short-lived medical school career was when I went to do a hospital opportunity program at the Jewish General Hospital, and I was put in a colonoscopy ward. And after 2 weeks of watching colonoscopies, I resolved then and there that I'm going to be a journalist, or definitely not a doctor. So I ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania. And I remember when I would spend a lot of weekends in New York City, read the New York Times in Central Park, and kind of see these amazing dispatches from Rio or Istanbul or Islamabad, and dream about being a foreign correspondent. I did an internship with the New York Times Magazine when I was 18 years old. Very excited to break Watergate and do sensational journalism. And my first assignment was about foods that cause sexual arousal. And my boss, who was going on television to promote the story, asked me if I would so kindly separate all the green M&Ms into a bowl from 6 giant packs of M&Ms. And so thus began my esteemed New York Times career. After Penn and a short-lived stint as a fact-checker, I got a scholarship from the Quebec government, and I studied European politics and economics at Oxford. After Oxford, I knocked at the door of the New Statesman, which is a political and literary magazine in London, which gave the world Martin Amis, and where a lot of luminaries had worked. And the managing editor, sorry, it's really, really hot in here, so I'm trying to hydrate, because the Wonder Woman, my inner Wonder Woman is a little being diminished by the hammam-like circumstances. So the very fearsome managing editor said, kid, don't waste your time, Parliament is out of session, and I said, come on, just let me stay for like 2 weeks. And so I stayed for 2 weeks. I wrote as much as I could. And then on my last day at the New Statesman, I wrote a proposal that the New Statesman should devote an issue to Britain's tortuous relationship with the European Union, which lives to this day, as we all know. And I put it under the door of the editor-in-chief. Now, when I look back on this as a 40-something man, I'm amazed at the chutzpah and brazenness of my 20-something self to do such a thing. I don't even know if I would do it now. But it was a good idea, because basically the following Monday, a few days later, the editor-in-chief of the magazine called me and said, Dan, I love your proposal. Come back and guest edit the New Statesman. So in many ways, that was my big break in journalism, and kind of the teachable moment, I guess, is, follow your dreams. Don't be afraid of taking risks, because it can pay off, and if it bombs, so what? You have nothing to lose. After the New Statesman, I ended up working at the Financial Times. I did a graduate traineeship there and beat out quite a few people. And I spent like 2 years covering the City of London, the financial sector, the London mayoral campaign. And my first editor was a woman called Chrystia Freeland, who's now the Foreign Minister of Canada. So life has really gone full circle, I should say, because Chrystia was my first boss. She was extremely demanding, never took no for an answer, but also very patient. I've since been a foreign correspondent based in London, Brussels, Paris, Istanbul, Prague, and New York. I get exhausted just reading that. And this recent move to Montreal has reminded me just how tough it is to move and uproot your entire life every 3 to 5 years, which is what you're in for if you want to be a foreign correspondent. During my last several years in London, I covered 11 terrorist attacks, as Taylor mentioned, including I covered 2 attacks in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and then the November 2015 attacks, the Brussels attacks, the Nice attacks, and on and on and on and on. In November 2015, when several 20-somethings with AK-47s opened fire on the Bataclan and just started spraying people out for a nice night on the town in Paris, I got called to the scene within a matter of hours. And it was really like one of the most horrifying things I've seen, because it was basically students your age, covered in blood, full of corpses. It was absolutely awful. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that what has amazed me every time I've covered terrorist attacks, other than the fact that the perpetrators almost always end up being people who have, little relationship to religion, who discovered radical Islam via the internet, and it's the same trajectory having covered these terrorist attacks. They always seem to follow the same personal narrative. But what I wanted to say was slightly more positive, which is the resilience of the human spirit has always amazed me. And within like 10 hours of seeing where people had been killed on these terraces, I came across a group of 20-somethings, much like yourselves, having a bottle of wine, like literally in front of La Belle Équipe, which the day before had been, 20 people had been killed. And I've seen that every single terrorist attack I've covered. People are always defiantly out the next day, and luckily we in Canada don't have to grapple with that, but it's nevertheless kind of amazing. On a slightly more upbeat note, I'm going to now go through some of my favorite stories and tell you a little bit why. About a decade ago, when I was a Brussels correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, I was asked to write about the legalization of prostitution and whether it worked. So I decamped to the red light district of Antwerp, where they created this tolerance zone where prostitution was legal. And I came across this brothel called Villa Tinto House of Pleasure, which was the world's only biometric brothel. And the idea was that all the prostitutes had to swipe their fingers in a biometric scanner, and it was window prostitution, and then every 15 minutes or so the lights would go off. And that way an illegal prostitute would not be able to work in the window. And the money that was used to rent the window was used to bankroll an anti-trafficking police force. So it was a very interesting and effective policy. Only 2 blocks away, women were being sold to the highest bidder in an institutionalized form of slavery, which taught me that legalization of prostitution can work to some extent, but actually the underworld will continue to go on otherwise. A few weeks later, my parents were visiting me in Brussels, and I decided to take them for dinner in Antwerp. And we happened to walk past the red light district to go to the waterfront, and all the prostitutes started opening their windows and saying, "Hey Dan, how's it going?" And suffice it to say, I don't think I've ever quite seen the same look on my mother's face since then. Another story that was probably the most memorable for me in my whole career was hunting war criminals in the Balkans. I think it was 2008. I was having dinner with a friend, a very wine-fueled dinner, I should add. And at midnight, someone rang me to say that Radovan Karadzic, one of the butchers of Bosnia, who was the political mastermind of the war in Bosnia in the late 90s, and one of the people behind the Srebrenica massacre, in which 11,000 Muslim men and boys had been led to the killing fields with their hands tied behind their backs, that he'd been arrested. And could I do the story for the New York Times, the front page story for the next day? I was pretty drunk at this point. I think I'd been through like 2 bottles of wine. And I guess the other teachable moment of that story is that, what you got to do. And as a journalist, when responsibility calls, you sober up pretty quickly. I was actually like in temporary housing at the time, and I only had an internet signal if I put my computer out the window at a 45-degree angle. So I do recall that was not one of my better moments. And actually, I was so freaked out and stressed out. I actually lied. I was on a date, if you really must know. And I left. And I was so stressed out. I left the woman like without paying the bill and ran to my apartment to write the story. And anyway, so it was a total fiasco. And then the next day, I had to fly to Belgrade. Anyway, I got to Belgrade and started retracing Karadic's footsteps. And by virtue of my contacts, having spent many years covering the former Yugoslavia, I found myself having tea and cookies with one of the men who'd hid Karadzic during the 15 years when he was at large. And the guy's wife was there, and she being a very nice hostess. And I was there with another colleague of mine, and he said to me, Karadzic got arrested so quickly. I still have his computer with his legal defense and his unfinished novel on it. Would you like to see it? And all I could think was like, how can I steal this computer without getting killed by this guy who must know Kung Fu if he's been harboring like the world's most notorious war criminal for 15 years. So do I have a USB? Like, how the hell can I get this thing into my pocket? And my colleague and I, we were looking at each other as he was unspooling the narrative of how he was hiding Karadzic. It was very, very frustrating because we were not able to steal the computer. So in any case, shortly thereafter, we started hunting for Ratko Mladic, who was the general in Bosnia who'd been on the run for 15 years. And slowly but surely, over 1 year, we discovered that the Serbian government was complicit in hiding Mladic. And as a result of my stories being published on the front page of the New York Times, Serbia's accession to the European Union was frozen. Everybody went into there was a foreign ministers meeting to decide on Serbia's future in the EU, and they all had my stories in their hand. And basically a year later, he was arrested. So that was probably one of the most gratifying, rewarding stories, because we have to do the sort of Justin Trudeau in a kurta story. But we all, also as a journalist, you can really have an impact on not only public policy, but on bringing justice. And I'd met a lot of the mothers of Srebrenica who lost their sons and fathers and brothers during the massacre. So Mladic getting arrested was probably one of the most meaningful stories of my career. Finally, I think I forgot a few. Another story that was very memorable that Taylor mentioned, the women warriors, was my story on the sworn virgins of Albania. In Albania, which is a quite poor, bedraggled country in the Balkans, people for decades lived under this ancient warrior code from the Ottoman Empire called the Kanun. And the Kanun mandates everything from hunting to finance to murder. And if you kill somebody under the Kanun, the family of the victim can take revenge and kill anybody in your family, any man that is. However, if you stay inside, you cannot be killed. So as a result, there are between 20 and 30,000 men and boys basically under virtual house arrest in Albania, and they can't go outside. So I did a story about these so-called blood feuds. But the corollary of the blood feuds is if a woman found herself in a family where all the men were trapped behind closed doors because they couldn't go outside, the only way a woman could survive socially in such a machismo, patriarchal society was to become a man. And these women would not have sex changes, but they would become men socially. And they would hunt, and they would be allowed to be in charge of finance by taking on the role of the man. But in return for being a man, they had to agree to be virgins for the rest of their lives. They had to swear an oath of virginity. And this phenomenon is known as sworn virgins. Anyway, I went trekking in the mountains of Albania, determined to find these sworn virgins who were kind of these mythical people that I'd read about in books. And much to my delight, I found 4 or 5 of them, and I wrote a story for the New York Times that ran on the front page. It became kind of a little bit of a sensation because it kind of tapped into the zeitgeist at the time. You know, there's some gender bending. It was women finding self-empowerment. And it's probably like one of the stories that I get the most emails from today, even like 10 years later. And Pasha Keki, who was the main character in my story, last time I heard when someone knocked at her door, she opened the door with an AK-47. And is not too pleased that that there's been a little bit of like sworn virgin tourism since my story came out. So I guess that's like another cautionary tale about being a journalist, which is that, you know, if you expose your favorite restaurant, a lot of people are going to be there the next day. And so, you know, that's part of the dynamic of being a journalist. Another story that's very, very memorable is, you know, Taylor mentioned I love writing crime stories. It's probably one of my favorite genres. And when I was a New York correspondent for the New York Times, I wrote a lot about crime. And I came across this one story that was quite sensational, which involved a young woman who was kind of an American dream story. She was Indian American. Her father had driven a taxi. She was now working on Wall Street. She had her own business. She fell in love with a man who said he was a policeman, but he never seemed to go out and never seemed to be policing. And she kind of got suspicious. She was smart. And eventually she decided to break up with him. He was none too pleased, and he raped her. And when she refused to drop the charges, he framed her for a series of elaborate armed robberies that never took place. So Simona was driving her car one day and she saw some flashing police lights in the rearview mirror, and she thought maybe there'd been a break in the rape case. Instead, the police officer slapped handcuffs on her. And when she was arraigned before a judge the following Monday, she discovered that she'd been framed for these elaborate armed robberies that never took place. And what Jerry did is he convinced 3 or 4 people to give false testimony and stage fake crimes where they would say they'd been mugged at gunpoint by a petite Indian woman dressed as a policewoman. Then he would handcuff them to a pole. The false witnesses would say that she cocked her gun during the robbery, and he would put bullets on the floor. And he slow dripped the clues over a course of the year. And in the American justice system, sometimes you can be guilty before you're proven innocent. And so people believe that Simona did the crime. She spent a year in jail. The rapist and the victim switch places. So he gets out of jail, she gets put in jail. She loses her daughter, she loses her business, and she loses everything. And then eventually the whole ruse came apart. I heard about the story, and I was the first person that greeted her when she got out of jail, because I was determined to write about that story. And it was probably one of the most remarkable stories of my career. I ended up covering the entire trial, and Jerry, by the way, got 40 years in jail, including for rape conspiracy. But it was a very, very interesting trial because Simona was a very strong woman, and even though she'd been through the most horrific circumstances and the justice system had failed her, you know, in rape cases, often juries don't always believe women. So it was a very, very interesting case. The other story that I think I wanted to mention before I end was after I arrived in London as a correspondent, shortly thereafter, in March 2015, 4 roguish thieves in their 60s and 70s wanted to commit like one last career-topping heist they hoped the world would never forget, and they succeeded. So these 4 guys in their 70s and 80s, they went to London's medieval diamond district, which is called Hatton Garden, armed with diamond-tipped drills. They abseiled down the elevator shaft into the safe deposit, bored 20-inch holes through reinforced concrete on a long Easter weekend and walked away with wheelie bins full of jewels, diamonds, and sapphires to the tune of $20 million. It was the most audacious heist in the history of Britain, and my great fortune was that it happened a couple of months after I arrived as the London correspondent of the New York Times. Now, amazingly, unfortunately for these guys, they were analog criminals in a digital age, and one of them drove his own car to the heist in London, which is probably the most CCTV ridden city in the world because of the history of terrorism. So it was not so difficult, along with license plate technology, which photographs license plates all over the city. So it was not so difficult to track down the men. They were eventually arrested, but they became working class heroes in the UK. And I'm writing a book about the case. And my story was optioned by Hollywood, so it's also being made into a film with Michael Caine actually playing the lead role. Although it's not the movie, there are 4 different productions of the story, but it's not mine that's being made into the film. But hopefully it will be good for the book. Anyway, so it's kind of like Ocean's 11 meets geriatrics, is how I describe it. So people keep asking me if I'm going to be bored in Canada after all of that, to which I reply, I don't miss being woken up at midnight on a Friday and being told that there's a guy marauding across London Bridge running people over, and can I go to the scene? A little bit of Kumbaya Canada will do me just fine for a little while after that. And also, since I've been back in Montreal, I've discovered that actually Canada is a very interesting story. I mentioned that one of the first stories I did was about the Bonjour High. I've written about the identity politics at the poutine. I wrote about an indigenous chef who is as adept with a shotgun hunting moose as she is with a spatula. And I went moose hunting with her in Maniwaki, which was a really great experience. And I have a story coming out next week on the mania of Leonard Cohen in Montreal. The other thing that people keep asking me is like, what has changed since I left? And I think the answer is that things have radically changed, and some things have remained exactly the same. So when I left in 1989, when many of you were probably born or probably not even in existence yet, Quebec had been buffeted by a referendum on independence. Thousands of Anglos were leaving the province. French Canadians were agitating for their rights. Today, the poutine is a treasured national dish, even though the Quebecois will be the first to tell you that it's Quebecois. And the younger generations seem far more interested in being the next Quebecois Bill Gates than fomenting revolution. But old habits do die hard. And when I was reporting my poutine story, I learned that in order for a poutine to be authentic, the curds must squeak when you bite into them, and that this being Quebec, they should squeak in French. So with